Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for including me in this hearing, although I don't regularly sit on this subcommittee. But this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I want to point out, Mr. Manning, North Dakota was the site of a spectacular oil train fire. The first responders there were, in fact, volunteers. And our fire chief, Tim McLean, said when I asked him what was the single most important kind of training that you had, he said the preparedness training that was done by FEMA. I think that when we're looking, especially with an interstate carrier, and I'm sensitive to the chairman's comments about what is the federal role and what's the state role, but as a former tax collector, I know that I ran into the 4Rs Act. You probably don't know much about it, but it greatly restricted how states could, in fact, tax railroads and other kind of common carriers, whether pipelines or railroads. And my point is that they did that because they wanted a system of interstate carriers, and they knew that this was a role under the Interstate Commerce Clause. But it also means that if you're going to restrict the funding sources, you may have to rethink, as you said, your tough choices. I share Senator Baldwin's concern that this training that Chief McLean talked about, which was so critical to his ability to respond in a way that not only protected his community, but protected the lives of his firefighters, is something that's on the chopping block, especially in the context of an interstate carrier. And so I just want to tell you that I have a lot of concerns about a budget proposal that doesn't adequately fund these grant programs. And we're going to be fighting pretty hard to make sure that, especially as it relates to the movement of hazardous material in interstate commerce, that the federal government see their role a little differently. Want to raise an issue that I've been raising since I've been here, probably come to it a little honestly, given that my father was a volunteer fire chief in a small community for about 25 years. The vast majority of land in the United States is covered by a volunteer fire force. In fact, in North Dakota, about 96% of all firefighters are our volunteers who don't get paid a dime, but we don't want them untrained either. What they do is hazardous. I want to make sure that we have the tools that we need. Some of those tools are these grants, and I'm concerned, as Deputy Secretary Mayorkas heard in my state, that these programs are difficult for volunteers to navigate. And I'm wondering, either for you, Mr. Manning, or you, Mr. Curry, if you could respond to how you could fashion a grant program, provided we still have it, that could take some of these high administrative costs. You know, frequently in these small grants, the money doesn't go where it belongs, in part because you guys are holding them accountable, and we applaud that, the two gentlemen in the middle. But we do see high administrative costs, high costs to apply for the grants, low dollar amounts, which then get spread out over services in a much narrower fashion. So I'm wondering whether you guys are looking at what you can do for the rural firefighters to make those grants more accessible.
Thank you, Senator. I myself was a volunteer firefighter for most of my life, actually, before I came to Washington. And I am very, very cognizant of how difficult it can be to interact with the state and federal government requirements on a part-time basis, manage that nights and weekends on top of a full-time job. And that said, as you rightly pointed out, we have a responsibility at FEMA and in the federal government to ensure that that grant money is being used appropriately. We're reducing or eliminating any possible elements of waste or duplication. But we are absolutely committed to making the programs as efficient and easy as possible while balancing those needs and those requirements. We are constantly evaluating all of our policy, the promulgation of new rules and policy, and grant applications and the grant processing and the things like the BISRs and all of the reporting things you have to do with getting a grant, with how can that be done by somebody potentially, in the wee hours of the night on an old computer with maybe a poor internet connection. It'd be very easy to just have a system where everybody, just kind of interacts online, but the reality is most fire departments in the world, in the U.S., and most emergency management organizations, most communities don't have that infrastructure. So we are absolutely committed to balancing both the oversight requirement and making sure that we appropriately adjudicate all of the audit findings and the things that our colleagues find when they're doing site visits, with the efficiency with which the grantees can interact with us in those manners.
I just think many times for the smaller agencies, it just becomes a non-starter, and as a result, we see old equipment, unless the community steps up, as many communities in my state have, to provide the resources. But we should all be thinking about what that fire service looks like into the future, because we're seeing fewer and fewer volunteers stepping up. We're seeing fewer and fewer folks willing to, kind of leave their work, or they don't work where the fire service is in their community. And this is going to be a challenge kind of going forward. And if we reduce the training support that we receive from FEMA and from FEMSA, if we reduce the incentives, because no one's going to want to fight a fire without training, or they shouldn't want to fight a fire without training, we will be jeopardizing kind of a critical piece of infrastructure in this country that we've relied on for a lot of years. And so I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing, and put on everybody's agenda the volunteer fire service and the challenges that we have. They serve the vast majority of area in this country is covered by a volunteer fire service. And so if we're going to continue to maintain that critical first response, we're going to need to work together to fashion some opportunities for the future.